In a Providence courtroom on an otherwise ordinary Thursday morning, a confrontation unfolded that would redefine the boundaries between political privilege and judicial authority. What began as a routine traffic violation hearing escalated into one of the most dramatic displays of judicial independence in Rhode Island history, a moment that would trigger investigations, end careers, and serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of nepotism in American democracy. This is the story of Tyler Morrison, the governor's nephew, who walked into court believing his family connection made him untouchable. It's about Judge Frank Caprio, a jurist with 35 years of experience who refused to bend to political pressure. And it's about what happens when someone mistakes proximity to power for immunity from the law. The exchange that followed would be watched by millions, analyzed in law schools, and remembered as a masterclass in how democratic institutions defend themselves against corruption. April, in Providence, carries the promise of renewal. But inside the municipal courthouse, the atmosphere was about to become charged with tension that had nothing to do with the weather. At 9:45 a.m., Tyler Morrison made his entrance. Everything about his arrival telegraphed entitlement, from the designer suit that cost more than most defendants' monthly rent, to the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to doors opening simply because of his last name. Morrison, 35 years old, served as a senior political consultant in his uncle's administration. Governor James Morrison was Rhode Island's chief executive, and Tyler had spent his adult life leveraging that connection. The result was a man who had forgotten, or perhaps never learned, that American democracy draws a bright line between political influence and legal authority. He was in court for a serious violation: reckless driving and street racing on Route 95. State police had clocked him at 95 miles per hour in a 50-mile-per-hour zone while racing another vehicle through traffic. The citation carried a minimum $500 fine and potential license suspension. But Tyler Morrison hadn't come to accept responsibility. He'd come to make a problem disappear, the way problems had always disappeared for him before. What he couldn't have anticipated was that he was about to challenge a judge who had built his career on one unshakable principle. In his courtroom, the Constitution mattered more than political connections. Judge Frank Caprio looked up from his paperwork as the court clerk announced the case. 45 years of legal practice and 35 years on the bench had given him an encyclopedic knowledge of human behavior, particularly the specific variety of arrogance that comes from political privilege. "Mr. Morrison," the judge began, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone who had never been intimidated by politicians, "you're charged with reckless driving and street racing. According to the state police report, you were traveling at 95 miles per hour in a 50-mile-per-hour zone while racing another vehicle." "How do you plead?" Tyler's response immediately signaled this would be no ordinary hearing. "Your Honor, I am pleading not guilty because this citation represents a fundamental misunderstanding. I wasn't street racing. I was driving to an important political meeting, and the officer made assumptions." Judge Caprio set down his pen, a gesture veteran court watchers recognized as ominous. "Mr. Morrison, the state police dash cam footage shows you and another vehicle accelerating together, weaving through traffic and reaching speeds of 95 miles per hour. That's not an assumption. That's documented evidence." Tyler's irritation became visible. "Your Honor, I think there's been a misunderstanding about who I am and the circumstances." The courtroom fell silent. Everyone sensed what was coming. "Mr. Morrison, your identity doesn't change the facts of the violation. Please explain what you mean by misunderstanding." Tyler paused, as if carefully selecting his words. What emerged revealed everything about his mindset. "Your Honor, I'm Tyler Morrison. My uncle is Governor James Morrison. I work as a senior political consultant for his administration. I think we can handle this situation more appropriately, given those circumstances. Judge Caprio's expression remained neutral, but those who knew him recognized the signs of a judge preparing to deliver a lesson in constitutional government. Mr. Morrison, are you suggesting that your relationship to the governor should affect how this court handles your case? Tyler shifted his weight, sensing danger, but too arrogant to retreat. Your Honor, I'm simply saying there are practical considerations. My uncle has significant responsibilities as governor. Having his nephew involved in a drawn-out legal process over what amounts to a minor traffic issue would be a distraction from important state business. The silence that followed was absolute. Tyler had just suggested that the governor's convenience outweighed the judicial process. But he wasn't finished making the catastrophic mistake that would define his political life. Your Honor, Tyler continued, his voice taking on an edge, I think you should be aware of certain realities. My uncle appointed several judges in this state, including some with oversight responsibilities. The city's budget depends on state funding that flows through the governor's office. I'm not trying to be difficult, but I think we should find a way to resolve this that works for everyone. Tyler Morrison had just threatened a sitting judge with political retaliation. He had crossed a line that would not only destroy his own reputation, but potentially damage his uncle's career and create the biggest judicial intimidation scandal in Rhode Island's recent history. What happened next would be discussed in law schools for years to come. Judge Caprio slowly stood from his bench, an unprecedented gesture that signaled something monumental was about to occur. He removed his glasses with deliberate precision and looked directly at Tyler, with the calm expression of someone about to deliver a constitutional education. Mr. Morrison, the judge said, his voice perfectly controlled but carrying the full weight of judicial independence. Did you just threaten this court with political retaliation? Tyler, still emboldened by what he mistook for judicial uncertainty, doubled down. Your Honor, I'm simply being realistic about how government functions. My uncle has responsibilities and relationships that extend beyond individual court cases. Judge Caprio nodded slowly, as if carefully documenting each word for the record. I see. Mr. Morrison, since you've threatened this court with political retaliation and invoked your uncle's position, let me share some information with you about how our system of government actually works. The judge walked to a shelf containing constitutional law references. You mentioned that your uncle appointed judges. Are you familiar with the constitutional principle of separation of powers and judicial independence? Tyler hesitated, finally sensing he was walking into an ambush. Your Honor, I understand that government branches work together. That's not what I asked, Mr. Morrison. Are you familiar with the constitutional requirement that the judicial branch remain independent from political pressure and intimidation? Tyler's confident demeanor began to crack. Your Honor, I never meant to threaten anyone. Mr. Morrison, Judge Caprio interrupted, his voice gaining authority. Threatening a judge with political retaliation is not just inappropriate. It's potentially criminal. It's called judicial intimidation, and it's a felony under Rhode Island state law. The arrogance drained from Tyler's face, as he realized he might have just committed a serious crime while being recorded in open court. Furthermore, Mr. Morrison, you suggested that I should consider the governor's convenience over the legal process. Let me share my qualifications with you. I've been practicing law for 45 years. I've served on this bench for 35 years. I've worked with 4 different governors, including your uncle. I understand constitutional law and judicial independence far better than political consultants who think their family connections make them experts on government. But Judge Caprio was just getting started. The judge pulled a thick file from his desk. Mr. Morrison, since you've invoked your uncle's name and threatened this court, I took the liberty of reviewing your traffic violation history. Tyler's face went pale. According to state records, you've received 8 traffic violations in the past 3 years. How many of those tickets did you pay, Mr. Morrison? The courtroom was dead silent. Your Honor, I'm not sure of the exact number. I'll help you with the exact number, Mr. Morrison. You paid 0. According to these records, you've had 8 citations dismissed or reduced, including 3 for excessive speeding and 1 previous reckless driving charge. Tyler tried to speak, but Judge Caprio continued with devastating precision. Furthermore, Mr. Morrison, state police records show 5 separate incidents where you invoked your uncle's name to avoid citations, including one where you told a trooper, and I quote, "Do you know who my uncle is? This ticket won't stick." Tyler's political arrogance evaporated, replaced by genuine terror as his pattern of privilege abuse was exposed in open court. Your Honor, those incidents were misunderstandings. Mr. Morrison, threatening law enforcement officers with political connections isn't a misunderstanding. It's abuse of political privilege. And now you've threatened a sitting judge with the same corrupt tactics. Judge Caprio's voice grew stronger, more authoritative. You suggested that your uncle's position as governor gives you special treatment. You threatened this court with political consequences. You've demonstrated a pattern of using political intimidation to avoid legal accountability. Mr. Morrison, not only am I finding you guilty of reckless driving and imposing the maximum fine of $1,000 plus court costs, but I'm also holding you in contempt of court for threatening judicial independence. Tyler's mouth opened in shock, but Judge Caprio continued. Furthermore, Mr. Morrison, I'm directing court administration to forward a complete transcript of today's proceedings to the Rhode Island Attorney General's office for investigation of judicial intimidation and abuse of political privilege. The courtroom buzzed with shock as Tyler realized the implications for his uncle's political reputation. But most importantly, Judge Caprio continued, standing at his full judicial authority, I'm referring this matter to the State Ethics Commission for investigation into whether Governor Morrison's administration has created a culture of privilege abuse by family members. Tyler looked as if he might collapse. Your Honor, you can't do this to my uncle's administration over a traffic ticket. Mr. Morrison, I'm not doing anything to your uncle's administration. You did this the moment you decided to threaten a sitting judge, while demonstrating a pattern of political privilege that reflects on the governor's leadership. Judge Caprio walked closer to the defendant stand. Mr. Morrison, let me share something with you about political power and judicial independence. I've served under 4 governors in my 35 years on this bench. I've seen political families come and go. I've watched politicians who thought they were untouchable learn that in this courtroom, the Constitution matters more than family connections. The judge's voice took on the tone of a professor addressing a failing student. Your uncle holds office at the pleasure of the voters, not at the pleasure of this court. But when political families use intimidation, threats, and privilege to avoid legal accountability, they undermine the very democratic system that gave them power in the first place. Tyler stood frozen, his earlier swagger completely destroyed. You walked into my courtroom today thinking you could threaten a judge with your uncle's position. Instead, you've demonstrated exactly why nepotism and political privilege are dangerous to democracy, and why judicial independence is essential to constitutional government. Judge Caprio returned to his bench to deliver his final judgment. A governor's nephew who threatens judges represents the same political family that threatens citizens. A politician whose family believes laws don't apply to them is a politician who believes democracy exists to serve their personal interests rather than the public good. He picked up his gavel. Mr. Morrison, your fine for the reckless driving violation is $1,000. Your contempt of court citation carries an additional $500 penalty. Your license is suspended for 6 months. But most importantly, you'll be explaining to the Attorney General, the Ethics Commission, and the voters why a sitting judge found your conduct to be corrupt and threatening to democratic governance. Tyler's voice was barely a whisper. Your Honor, please. My uncle didn't know about any of this. I'm not finished, Mr. Morrison. You mentioned that your uncle appointed judges and controls state funding. Let me tell you what affects judicial independence. The Constitution, the rule of law, and the principle that no political connection grants immunity from legal accountability. Judge Caprio looked out at the packed courtroom, including several political reporters who had come expecting a routine traffic case. Let this be a lesson to every political family watching. Your elected office is a privilege granted by the people, not a license to threaten judges, ignore laws, or corrupt the system that gave you power. When political families believe they're above the law, democracy itself is in danger. He looked back at Tyler, who stood with his head bowed in complete humiliation. Mr. Morrison, I strongly recommend that you and your uncle spend time reflecting on the difference between public service and personal privilege, between political leadership and political corruption. Judge Caprio raised his gavel. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down with finality. As the courtroom emptied, Tyler stood alone at the defendant table, staring at the citation that had just cost him $1,500 and potentially destroyed his uncle's political career. The political privilege that had protected him for years had been systematically dismantled by a judge who understood that democracy only works when everyone follows the same laws. Political reporter Michael Torres, who had witnessed the entire proceeding, turned to his colleagues. I've covered Rhode Island politics for 15 years. I've never seen anything like what just happened. A sitting judge just documented a pattern of political privilege abuse by the governor's family in open court. As Tyler left the courthouse, his phone buzzed constantly with messages from his uncle's staff, campaign advisors, and party officials who had watched the proceedings. Within hours, the video would be viewed over 3 million times. Political blogs analyzed Judge Caprio's systematic exposure of Tyler's privilege as a perfect example of judicial independence checking political abuse. Law schools began using the exchange as a teaching tool about separation of powers and the dangers of nepotism. The real impact was felt immediately at the State House. Within hours, the Rhode Island Attorney General's office announced a formal investigation into the Morrison administration. The State Ethics Commission opened an inquiry. 3 major newspapers called for the governor to address his nephew's behavior. By evening, Governor James Morrison held a press conference. I've just learned about my nephew's conduct in court today. His behavior and his invocation of my name to threaten a judge does not represent the values of public service or respect for law that should characterize anyone connected to this administration. I apologize to Judge Caprio and to the people of Rhode Island. The governor's approval ratings dropped 12 points within a week. Tyler Morrison resigned from all political consulting work. The Attorney General's investigation concluded that while the governor himself wasn't involved in his nephew's intimidation tactics, the administration had failed to establish clear boundaries about family members trading on political connections. 6 months later, Tyler Morrison stood before Judge Caprio for his final hearing. Gone was the arrogant political consultant. In his place stood someone who finally understood that family connections don't grant immunity from consequences. Years later, political science students study the Morrison case as an example of how quickly political reputations can be damaged when family members abuse privilege. Professor Janet Walsh at Brown University regularly tells her students, Judge Caprio didn't destroy the governor's nephew to make a political point. He did it to protect democracy from political families who think they're above the law. The video of that Thursday morning became one of the most watched political accountability moments ever recorded, shared millions of times across social media. For those who knew Judge Caprio, it was simply another example of what made him exceptional. the ability to defend constitutional principles against political pressure and to transform political arrogance into democratic accountability. The Morrison case proved that judicial independence isn't just a legal principle, it's the foundation that prevents democracy from becoming a system where political families rule rather than serve. It demonstrated that in American courts, the Constitution still matters more than family connections, and that no one, regardless of their uncle's office, is above the law. In that Providence courtroom on an April morning, Judge Frank Caprio reminded us all that the separation of powers isn't just a concept taught in civics classes. It's the living, breathing defense mechanism that protects democracy from the oldest form of corruption, the belief that some families are born to rule while others are born to obey. Tyler Morrison learned that lesson the hard way, and millions who watched learned it alongside him.